Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the first book of Chronicles, that is Divrei Hayomim Aleph. We are about to study Perek Chaf Zayin, that is chapter 27. We have just learned and read in the previous chapters of all the preparations David did to set up the kingdom for success, so that when his son Shlomo, his son Solomon, would take over the kingship, that he would have everything he needs for a successful kingdom and everything he needs, especially to build, establish, and support the temple service and the temple building, etc. After describing all of the items and raw materials and workers and everything that was necessary to get ready, we then discussed how David divided up the families of the Kohanim, the priests, how he divided up the families of the Levium, the Levites, the priests for the temple service and all the other things they did, and the Levites for the worship, the prayer, the song, the Levites for taking care of the items of the Beit HaMikdash, the treasury, the Levium, the Levites for the gatekeepers and guards, and so on and so forth. Now, in this chapter, we are going to study how we are going to read how David divided up the people of Israel into groups. It's really a setup of kind of like army reserves, right? A certain army that would always be on hand for security needs, for needs of policing the kingdom, and so on. And because everyone needs to have a life, they need to be able to take care of their homes, their families, their farms, etc. But if everyone's divided into groups so that everyone does 1 month a year, a very similar system to what we would consider like an army reserve today. And that's what we're going to read about now, how he divided up the general public, the people of Israel, from among all of the tribes. So Uvenei Israel, and the children of Israel, lemisparam, according to their numbers. Roshei ha'avos, the heads of the families, v'sarei ha'alafim, and the heads of the thousands, v'hameos, and the heads of the hundreds, v'shotrehem, and their the shotrehem is like police officers, hamishar sim es hamelach, that service the king, l'chol devar hamachlekos, for all of the matters which the divisions of the people that are we're going to read about how they were divided up were necessary, haba'al v'hayotzeis, that were came and would leave chodesh b'chodesh, each and every month. So every month, the first day of the month, the last group would go home and the new group would take over their jobs, right? L'chol chodshei hashana, for every single month of the year, hamachlokes achas esrim v'arba'a elef. There was 24,000 soldiers called to service each month that would serve that month, and then they would go home the rest of the 11 months of the year. So, and this was, of course, necessary to set up the state. If you think about how important this is now that the people are busy starting the new state, reading about this gives each person a sense of place, and they realize how this is my role to play, so that they can set up the new kingdom in a similar fashion with rotations, and it gives each person, I'm a member of this brigade, I'm a member of this brigade, etc., and I serve this month. It gives everyone an opportunity to participate in the defense of the country and in the security needs of the country. So al hamachalokes harishona, for the first machlokas, the first division, right? Lachodesh harishon, who served in the first month, Yashav ben Zavdiel, the head, the general in charge, the commander in charge of the first group for the first month, was Yashav, the son of Zavdiel. Bial machalukto esrim bi'arba elef, and he had 24,000 soldiers within his group. Min b'nei Peretz, he was a descendant of Peretz. Peretz was, of course, one of the sons of Judah. So this was a group of members of the tribe of Yehuda. L'chol sorei hatzvaos lachodesh harishon, right? Harosh, he was the head. In other words, the person who we just mentioned before, Yashav was the head for all of the officers of the army in the first month. So he was the commander, and all the officers served beneath him. That was month number one. As we go through this, I'm going to speed through a little bit because it's repetitive, but this is it's important to just get the sense of what the chronicler is trying to do here. So v'yam machlokes achodesh hasheni, on the group, the division that served in the second month, was another person whose name was Dodai ha'achochi. Dodai, from a place called Achoach. And umachlokto, and his division umiklot hanogid, and he also had a co-commander, similar to, I guess, what we would have today, an executive officer. Um, his name was Miklot. So you had Dodai plus, as the commander, Miklot plus his first right hand man, Vial Machlukto, and in his group also Esrim Viarba Elef, there's 24,000. Sarhat Savah Hashlishi, the general in command, the commander of the third group, Lachodesh Hashlishi, for the third month, was Binayahu Ben Yehoyada HaKohen. Was Binayahu Ben Yehoyada. We've heard of him. He was one of David's military heroes. His name pops up significant amount of times. He was a Kohen, a priest. Roshi was in charge. So there were priests again involved in the defense as well. And in his group, also 24,000. Who Vinayahu? He is the Binayahu, which we know of from many stories. Gibar Hashloshim Bi'al Hashloshim. He was one of the Gibar here, meaning a great warrior hero. Who was a member of the 30, referring to 30 outstanding soldiers. Benayahu was a member of that group, Umachalukto, and in his division, he had another assistant officer too, Amizavad Beno, and that was Amizavad, who was the son of Benayahu, who was his executive officer. Harivi'i, the fourth one, Chodesh Harivi'i, who was in charge. It seems that these other 24 groups of 24,000 weren't necessarily members of one specific tribe or another. They probably were made up of a mix of people from different tribes. So Harivi'i, the fourth one, in the fourth month with Asoel. Asoel, we're familiar with him too. He was the Achi Yoav. He's the brother of Yoav. Yoav is the head of the entire military, the top general. And his brother was Asael, who was one of the monthly generals or monthly commanders of the fourth group. Zavadia beno Acharav, and his assistant was Zavadia, who was the son of Asael. He also had 24,000 soldiers. Hachamishi l'chodesh hachamishi, the fifth month, was Hasar, the one in charge. The commander was Shamhut HaYizrach. Shamhut, from a place called Yizrach. There was also 24,000. Hashishi, the Chodesh Hashishi, the 6th month, was Ira Ven Ikesh. Ira, the son of Ikesh, Hatekoi, from the town of Tekoa. A town that pops up a bunch in throughout the words of the prophets, a town in the land of Judea. In the tribe in the property of Judea. And there was 24,000 in his group. Hashvi, the 7th month, Hashvi, the 7th group. Cheletz Hapiloni. This was a man named Cheletz who from Piloni. Min B'nai Ephraim. He was an Ephraimite. He was from the tribe of Ephraim. He also had 24,000 troops. Hashmini l'chodesh Hashmini, the 8th, was Sibchai Hachushati Lazarchi. He was Sibchai the Chushite, meaning he came from the family of Chush, Lazarchi, and he was from a place called Zarchiva, also 24,000. Hatishii, Lachodesh Hatishii, the 9th month, Aviezer Ha'antoti, Aviezer from Anatot, Labain Imini, he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Anatot is a famous town. We know the prophet Jeremiah came from the town of Anatot, also a town that we're very familiar with. He also had 24,000. The 10th month, the 10th group for the 10th month, Maharai Hanetofati. Maharai, who was from, it was a Netofati, also Lazarchi, also from Zerach. Zerach being, I think I made a mistake before. I read Lazarchi as a place. It doesn't mean a place. The Zerach is one of the sons of Yehuda, and so he was from the family of Zerach. I apologize for the mistake. And in his group there was 24,000. The 11th, for a group for the 11th month. Binayah Hapir Otonim in Bnei Ephraim was another Ephraimite, right? His name was Binayah from Pir Aton. Also 24,000. Hashnei Masar Lishnei Masar Chodesh Cheldai Hanetofati was Cheldai from Netofa li Otniel. He was a descendant of Otniel. Otniel ben Kenaz. We remember he was the first of the judges, the one who took over after Joshua was Otniel. So he was a descendant of that Otniel. He also had 24,000 soldiers. So again, I want to emphasize that when we're counting troops and we're counting for a particular purpose and need, it's okay to give a number and count. And it's going to pop up again. But when you're counting just for pride, to show how many people we are, to see how great we are, that is when God has a problem with counting. But when you're counting for a purpose and you're dividing up the people, yeah, of course, for such reasons, counting is fine. It's not counting specifically that's the problem. It's counting, it's what the purpose of the counting is. V'al Shivtei Yisrael, now at verse 16, now we're going to list the heads of the tribes, the Nasi, the chief of each tribe. V'al Shivtei Yisrael Roveni Nagid. Over Reuven, there was a chief, a Nagid, Eliezer ben Zichri. So here it's using a different term. It's using a term called a Nagid, rather than a Nasi, which is the term used in the Torah itself. But his name was Eliezer ben Zechri Shimoni for the tribe of Shimon. Shefatya ben Maacha, that was his name. Levi. For the Levites, it was Chashavia ben Kemuel. And Li Aaron, and for the Aaronites, right, the Kohanim, the priests, also Tzadok, was the Kohen Gadol, and also was the chief, not just for the service in the temple, but also like an administrative chief or governor or something like that. Yehuda, Elihu me'achei David. For Yehuda was Elihu, who was one of David's brothers, was in charge of the tribe of Judah. The Yisachar, Omri ben Michael. Yisachar was Omri, the son of Michael. Zvulun, for the people of Zvulun, Yishmayahu ben Ovadyahu. The Naphtali, Yerimot ben Azriel. For Naphtali, that's who it was. Livnei Ephraim, Hoshea ben Azazyahu. Livnei Ephraim was Hoshea, familiar name, the same name as the name of the prophet. It's interesting. The first of the 12 minor prophets, we studied that together a couple years ago in this podcast, but obviously it's not the same person here, but this is Hoshea, that name being used. Again, I've pointed that out a few times, that these names are interesting because you see you get to learn and know the history of Hebrew Jewish names. Many of these names still used today. We mentioned Azriel before, Ovadyahu, Hoshea, Menashe. We're about to see Lachatzi Shevet Menashe, Yoel ben Pidayo. So in Menashe it was Yoel, also the same name as the prophet Yoel. Lachatzi HaMenashe Gilada, and since Menashe was divided into halves, the first, the Yoel was for the half of the tribe of Manasseh, which was on the west side of the Jordan, the half which is in Gilad, which is on the east side, Yido ben Zicharyahu, Levinyamin Yaasiel ben Avner. For the Benjaminites, it was Yaasiel, the son of Avner. Lidon Azarel ben Yerocham. For the tribe of Dan, it was Azarel, son of Yerocham. Eles Areshivtei Israel. These were all 12 of the tribal heads. V'lo nasa David misparam. Remember we mentioned before, but now that we just listed who the heads of the tribes are, there's no numbers for them. When we're not counting soldiers and we're not giving out jobs, David did not count them. He did not count the children, right? Because the people under the age of 20, because there was no purpose in doing that. The ones above 20, he needed to count in order to divide up his soldiers and set up his brigades and his battalions, etc. But for these, because God had said that the people of Israel should grow and be as numerous as the stars in the sky. In other words, that's a sign of blessing, and it's not something that we should count. When we're talking about our blessings, when we're talking about how lucky we are and how fortunate we are, we don't sit and give numbers to them, because that only leads to pride. Yoav ben Tzruya, because remember the story that we learned a couple chapters ago, and we also read about in the book of Samuel, Yoav ben Tzriya, Hechelim note, did start counting, below Chila, but he did not complete it because we learned that that ended up in disaster. Vayibazos Ketzef Yisrael, and as a result of his counting, there was anger against the people of Israel. Velo Allah HaMispar, and and the numbers that he counted did not even get entered in the book. They didn't even write the results of his partial census down because that census was just a disaster and it was a big mistake. To verse 25, so before we talked about the the Levites who were in charge of watching the temple treasures. But now we have the treasures that belong to the king. On the treasury of the royal treasuries, Azmavet ben Adiel was in charge of the royal treasury. Bial ha'otzrot basodeh be'orim uvakvarim uvamigdalot Yonasan ben Uziyahu. There was also, in addition to the royal treasury, there was the local treasury, the treasuries that involved the economic affairs of the various precincts, the various towns and regions. So the one who was in charge of those was Yehonatan ben Uziyahu. And what about in charge of the people, in charge of the workers that farmed the land? Someone needed to be in charge of the Department of Agriculture, so to speak, to work the land. Ezri ben Kilub, that was his name. Al Hakramim, and then in addition to the people that worked the land, which is more those people that plowed and planted grain and harvested the grain, etc. But there was also the vineyards, right, which had a different type of care taking. They had the Department of Vineyards, which was run by Shim'i Haramati, Shim'i from Ramah. Ramah is a familiar place. We know Shmuel was from that location as well. V'al Shabakramim Le'otzrot Hayayin, and the one who was in charge of the wine, in other words, that was produced by the vineyards, there was another person in charge of that. His name was Zabdi Hashifmi, Zabdi from Shifmi. V'al hazeitim, v'hashikmim, and then the other orchards, right, which required a different kind of agricultural work, the olive groves and the sycamore groves, Asher Bashvela, which were in the Shvela region. The one in charge of that was Baal Chanan Hagderi. And the produce of the olives, which is the oil, Vial Otzrot Hashemen, the one who was in charge of storing and keeping the oil was Yoash, was a person by the name of Yoash. Interesting, similar to the king's name, Yehoash, but this is with an ayin. It's spelled in Hebrew, so it's actually a little different. Even though in modern Hebrew we pronounce the ayin and aleph the same, so the name sounds the same, but Yoash is more correctly pronounced something like Yoash, right? And it's a different name. V'al HaBokar, and who is in charge of the cattle? The cattle Haroim Basharon that grazed in the Sharon region, Shirtai Hasharoni, that was his name. The Alabakar Ba'amokim, and the cattle that grazed in the valleys, Shafat ben Adloi. So they were in charge of that. The Al Hagmalim, and the one who was in charge of the camels, Ovil Hayishmaeli, was Ovil the Ishmaelite. The Al Hatonot, and the one who was in charge of the donkeys, Yechtiyahu HaMeiron Noti, Yechtiyahu from Meiron, the town of Meiron. Whether that's the same as the modern town of Meiron in northern Israel or not, I'm not sure, but that's the name of the town. V'al Hatzon Yaziz HaHagri, was Yaziz the Hagrite from. So this is interesting because we had a Yishmaeli, an Ishmaelite, and we have a Hagrite. Was whether this has to do with whether they were descendants of Ishmael or they just were called that because they came from those lands where Ishmaelites lived is unclear. But there's that would be something interesting to dwell into. Kol elesh sarei harochush asher lemelech David. These are all the ones who are in charge of all of the property that the King David owned and had amassed for the monarchy. V'Yonasan dod David, and Yonatan, who was the uncle of David, Yoetz, he was an advisor to the king. Ish Mevin, he was a person of wisdom and understanding. V'Soferhu, and he was a scribe. He was able to record. V'Yechiel ben Chachmoni, and in Bnei Amelech was with the king's sons. Um, an alternate way of reading this verse that I just read, the way the cantillations divide up the verse makes it a little challenging. But if we read it properly, I'm going to read this verse 32 again. Yehonatan, the uncle of David, was a Yoetz Ish Mevin, Visofer who, which the way the cantillations are written, it sounds like it's saying that Yehonatan, the one who we just said is the advisor, is a scribe. But then immediately it says Vichiel ben Chakmoni. So one could read it in a different way if we change the way the cantillations are written, and we would just read, for those that are not aware, in the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text, there are cantillations, which are kind of like, punctuation, commas, and so on. But if we make the comma in a different place, you could read Visofer hu Vichiel ben Chakmoni. That and the scribe was Vichiel, the son of Chakmoni. In other words, that the name Yechiel is referring to the scribe, and the scribe was not the same person as Yonatan. Achitophel Yoetz Lamelech, and Achitophel, we're familiar with him from many of the stories in the book of Samuel. He was a major advisor to the king, V'chushai ha'arki Re'ah Hamelech. And Chushai, the Arki, was the Re'ah, the friend. We find in some of the medieval literature, the hand of the king, the close friend, the guy who's his best, who is closest helper. And then we conclude this chapter of Yacharei Achitophel after Achitophel was gone, and the story of Achitophel was mentioned in at length in Samuel, how his life ended. So after he left the scene, Yehoyada ben Benayahu, his position was taken over by Yehoyada, the son of Benayahu, the Eviatar, and Eviatar also took part and was one of those that replaced Achitophel, the Sard Saval Melech Yoav, and the king's overall arching general, the one who was the commander of the entire army, we mentioned several times, that was Yoav. And that concludes the list of all of David's, the people in charge of David's kingdom, how he divided his armies, how the reserves were set up into 12 groups, and the heads of all of the tribes, etc., etc. Now we have a structure, a governmental structure for David to rule the kingdom, and that he will hand over to his son when David passes on. Thank you so much for studying chapter 27 together with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 28 and the rest of this beautiful book of Chronicles. I wish you all a wonderful day.